This month we'll be doing 4 blocks and they all use half square triangles. Our first block is the pinwheel and it only takes 2 fabrics, the brown and the green. And from that we are going to cut 2 3.5-inch squares from each piece. I'm going to go ahead and put mine right sides together and cut them at the same time. You don't have to do this. And I'm going to clean up one edge. If you want to, and your fabric's big enough, you can always cut these bigger because we are going to be trimming them down. But even at 3.5, we're supposed to be trimming them down. So I cleaned 2 sides. And then 3.5 times 2 is 7. So I'm going to put my 3.5-inch mark on the long edge that I clean cut, and my 7-inch on my short edge, and then cut, and I need them to be 3.5-inch squares, so I'm going to scoop my ruler back to 3.5. I do keep lines on my long edges, and cut. You need to mark your squares one of 2 ways. You can either put a ruler down on your square and mark one line point to point, and if you do that, then when you go to the sewing machine, you're going to sew 1/4 of an inch from that line on each side. Or you can use a magic wand and mark the lines that you're going to stitch. So I'm putting my scored line on the magic wand down on opposite points, and I'm going to mark on both sides of that. And in that case, I'm going to sew on the lines. And I'm just using a mechanical pencil. You probably don't want to use a Sharpie or something that will soak through, but a pencil will work. You could use a Frixion pen. You could use chalk. I'm going to mark both of these. Oops. And then I'm going to take them to the sewing machine and stitch on both of those lines. I've sewn on both sides of the line and I don't know how well it shows up. And now I'm going to cut these blocks apart between the lines. You can use scissors if you want to. I find it just as easy to use a rotary cutter. I'm just putting my 1/4-inch mark on one of my stitched lines and cutting. I'll do the same thing to the other one. And then we're going to open them up and press toward the brown. So we're getting, with those 2 blocks, we're getting 4 half square triangle units. Now that my blocks are pressed, I'm going to trim them down to 3 inches. I can do it with a regular ruler. A square one makes it easier. If I were using a square ruler, I would line up my diagonal line with my seam, trim these 2 edges, then rotate and trim it down to the 3 inches. Again, I would line up that diagonal line. Because I have it and really like it, I'm using the Block Lock ruler. The Block Lock ruler for the half square triangle, well, they all do, has a groove cut out of the back. And the way it works is that groove locks right onto your seam when you've pressed it to one side. I would recommend, if you don't have one, the 4.5-inch size or the 5.5-inch size. I rarely cut half square triangles any bigger than that. There's no reason that you need every single size of this ruler. So see, it just kind of rides on the seam. Yes, I can move it out, but it's not moving now, and it's not moving now. So unless you really work at it, it will sit right there on the seam. So I'm checking to make sure that I have at least 3 inches all the way around, a little bit to trim. There's not a lot extra. It's locked on the seam. You want to make sure that the point is going on the point of the ruler, because you can lock it on this way, but you're going to get a strange looking block. So I want it this way. Make sure I have at least 3 inches, something to trim all the way around. I'm going to trim 2 sides. And then I don't even need to pick the ruler up. I can just twist it around, and if it comes off, that's okay. I'm going to slide the ruler back because it has markings on both sides. And I'm going to line up my 3-inch mark with the 2 edges I just cut and trim the last 2 edges. So that's one. And we're going to do it again. So it's not a lot extra. I'm going to line it up, make sure the point's on the seam. Trim two sides. Rotate. Slide back to the 3-inch mark. Trim. And trim. I'll do one more on the camera. Again, points on the seam. Trim. Trim. Rotate. Slide back to the 3-inch mark. Trim. And trim. So we're going to trim all four. Once everything's trimmed, we're going to sew this together into a 4-patch. You do want to arrange it so you get the pinwheel effect. So do lay it out before you start sewing. I'm going to sew this pair together and then this pair together. We made lots of 4-patches last month. Once those are together, I'm going to press one way. You can take your pick. Really shouldn't make any difference. I'll probably press toward the brown. And then I will sew them together, matching that center seam, and I'll come back after I have done that. Alright, I've stitched it together to this point. And just like we did last month, I'm going to pop the seams. Remember, if I go one way, it won't work. It only works one way. So I can pop it, and it's going to make a little tiny pinwheel there in the center. And then I will press those seams the way they're going. But that is what our finished pinwheel block looks like. It should be 5.5 inches at this point. Our next block is the Greek key, and there are two pieces of fabric. There's a red and a gold, and they're both the same size. We're going to start by cutting the gold. So just like usual, we're going to clean up two edges. And then we need it to be 8.5 inches long, 4 1/4. 8.5 by 4 1/4. So I'm going to line up my 4 1/4 on the long edge, my 8.5 on the short, and cut, cut. And then the first thing I want to do is cut a 1.5 inch strip off of this. So I'm lining up my 1.5 inch mark along the long edge. Any lines along the short to keep it straight. We'll keep that piece at that size. So now this should be 2 3/4. It is. We're going to back our ruler up because we're going to cut a 2-inch section off of one end. So we're going to back it up to 6.5. So I'm going to put a long line on the long edge, a 6.5 inch mark on the short edge, and cut. And then I'm going to back up to 2 3/4. And so any line on the long edge to keep it straight, your 2 3/4 inch mark down here, and cut. I did need the 8.5 inch strip. I need the 2-inch strip out of the way. 2 3/4, we want that, and I'm going to cut this again to make this one 2 3/4. So after you cut your first long skinny strip, you need two 2 3/4 inch squares and one 2-inch square, and this one is 2 inches. I just have more than I need on the bottom edge. So 2 inches. So what? Wait a minute, that's not 2. 2 inches. At least I'm cutting bigger and not too small. Okay. So out of that, we got one piece that's 1.5 by 8.5, two squares that are 2 3/4 inches square, and one square that's 2 inches. On our red strip, it's very similar to the gold. We just don't need the 2-inch square. So I'm going to clean up two edges. And then Actually, it does not need to be as wide a strip here. We need to cut this, the width, when we add our 2 3/4 inch square and our 1 1/4 inch square, to 4 inches wide, and it needs to be 8 1/2 long. We're going 4 inches by 8 1/2. So my 4 inch mark is on my long edge that I cleaned up already. My 8 1/2 is on the short edge that's been cleaned up. Cut and cut. And then I need a 1 1/4 inch wide strip. So I'm going to line my 1 1/4 inch mark up with the long edge and cut. And then I need two 2 3/4 inch squares. So that would be 5 1/2 inches. I hope. Yeah, it is. 5 1/2. This piece is scrap. Slide back to 2 3/4 and cut. So out of the red, all you need is our 1 1/4 inch wide strip by 8 1/2 and our 2 squares that are 2 3/4 long. On the wrong side of the gold, I'm going to mark it so I can make half square triangles, so it's going to be exactly like we did for the pinwheel block. You can either just use any ruler, do one line point to point, so 1/4 inch from both sides of that line, or you can use the magic wand, line up the scored line on opposite points and mark on both sides. And then we're going to sew on that line. You're going to put your gold right sides together with your red. I've stitched my 2 lines and stitching my gold and my red pieces together. I'm going to cut them in half. If your seam's not perfect when you cut it in half, it's no big deal. And we are going to press toward the red. I've pressed all my half square triangles, and we're going to now trim these squares down to 2 1/4. So again, I could use a square ruler, and there's not a lot extra on here. I would just clean up 2 sides, rotate, and then line up my 2 1/4 with the lines that I just did. Again, I'm going to use a block lock. And remember, there's not a lot, and I don't have a solid line this time. I just have the 1/4 inch marks, which is fine. So I'm going to go 2 sides, rotate. If it comes off, that's okay. And now I'm lining up my 2 1/4 inch mark right here with the cut edges of the square. Cut. Cut, and I'm going to trim all 4 of those down exactly the same way. We're going to take our 2 long strips, the red's 1 1/4 and the gold's 1 1/2, and we're going to sew them together along the long edge, and then we will press toward the red on that strip. I have my red and gold pieces sewn together, and I have pressed toward the red. Now from this we need to cut 4 2-inch slices. This should be 1 1/4, and mine is. So I'm going to line this up with a line on the seam. I like to do that to keep everything straight, and there should be lines lining up on the cut edges as well. I'm going to cut, and then I'm going to walk around, and we need 4 2-inch pieces, so that's 8 inches. I'm lining up my 8-inch mark down here. I have a line lined up on the seam and lines on the 2 outside edges. I'm going to cut. I'm going to scoot back to 6 inches. On the short end, I'm still keeping everything lined up on the long edges. I'm going to cut, go back to the 4-inch mark. Still everything lined up. Cut, and then back to the 2-inch mark and cut. And now I'm ready to put all my pieces together into a 9 patch. So it goes there. We're going to put the red in toward the center. It really is red in toward the center everywhere. My 2-inch gold piece that I hadn't done anything with. And there, and there. So what I'm going to do is sew it together in rows. That would be a row, that would be a row, and that would be a row. After I've done that, I'm going to press in toward the center, out on the center row, and then in again on the bottom row. My rows are sewn together, and like I said, I pressed in on the top and bottom rows and out on the middle row. I did say this was a 9 patch, and it is a 9 patch, but it is not an even 9 patch. So if I was drawing a grid, all my squares wouldn't be the same size. It's narrower going this way and going this way. So now that I have my rows together, I'm going to sew them together to finish the block. My spots to match are just these seams in here. And since the seams are pressed opposite directions, it should work fairly easily. Here's my finished Greek square. I did pop the seams after I sewed it together and pressed so that they're going all different directions. It just gives me flatter intersections. For our next block, which is the Texas puzzle, we have an orange square, a beige strip, an orange check rectangle, and a brown rectangle. First thing we're going to do is cut our orange square down to 1 inch. Any ruler will work. I just do our usual clean cut 2 edges. I'm not going to walk around for a 1 inch square. Boy, that's tiny. Going 1 inch. My 1 inch marks on both edges. I'll set that aside. Then from my beige strip, I need 4 2 3/4 by 1 inch strips. I'm going to go ahead and fold it in half so that I'm cutting 2 at a time. So I need to cut this down to 1 inch wide. Clean up that one edge. It's 1 inch, sorry. I'm not used to cutting 1 inch. It's a rare thing. Cut, cut, and 2 3/4 times 2 is 5.5 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and line my 5.5 inch mark down here on my short end. And remember, I did fold this in half, so I'm cutting 2 at a time. Cut off that end, and then I'm going to scoot back to 2 3/4. And that gives me my 4 1 by 2 3/4 inch strips. From my brown and my orange rectangles, I need 2 3.5 inch squares. I'm going to cut them together, and I put them right sides together so they're ready to sew when I'm done. So 2 3.5 inch squares, that means it needs to be 7 inches long by 3.5 inches wide. I'm going to clean up 2 edges. Walk around or turn the mat around. I'm going to make it 3.5 wide by 7. So my 3.5 inch mark is on my long edge, my 7 inch mark is on the short. I'm going to cut. And I'm going to slide my ruler back to 3.5 inches. Any long lines on the edges. 3.5, cut, and we've made half square triangle units in the last 2 blocks. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing again, either one line, corner to corner, and so 1/4 inch from both edges, or the magic wand, line up the score line, corner to corner, and mark, and mark. Same thing on the other one. And if you didn't already have your squares together, right sides together. You will need to put them, an orange one with a brown one, right sides together, and we're gonna sew 2 lines. Okay, I have sewn my 2 lines. Just like on the last 2 blocks, we're going to cut this apart, and we're going to press toward the brown. I don't know what the pattern says, but brown will do. So open them up and toward the brown. We're going to trim these squares down to 2 3/4 inches. So again, you could use a square ruler, and we have a little extra to trim on this one. That's nice. Again, my diagonal line, if I was using the square ruler, would be on the seam. I would clean cut 2 edges, then I would rotate it and cut it down to the 2 3/4. But of course, I'm using the block lock. Remember, with the block lock, we always want to get it on with the point on the seam. We're going to cut, rotate, and if it doesn't want to rotate and it sticks to the mat. And again, we don't have a solid line. We're just going to get the 2 3/4 mark here and here on the edges that we've already cut, and trim and trim. And we are going to trim all 4 blocks exactly the same way. Now we're ready to sew together into rows. So I'm going to lay my block out like this. So between my half square triangle units, I'm going to put a beige strip on both sets. And then I'm going to put my little 1-inch square in the center and beige strips sewn onto both edges of that. So again, we're making a 9 patch. This one's a very irregular 9 patch because here and here are much narrower than here. Than this going this way. My rows are sewn together. On the top and bottom rows, I pressed in toward the center, and on the center row, I pressed out toward the edge. So now, we're just going to sew our rows together, and the spot to match is right here, right here, right here, and right here. Here's the finished Texas puzzle block. I did pop the seams so that they're going different directions when I did my final pressing. Our next block is Puss in the Corner. There's just 2 fabrics, what she's calling a gold strip, and it does have a golden tinge to it, and a green strip. We're going to cut our gold strip down to 3 inches wide by 12 inches long. And my ruler's a little bit short for what I'm doing here, but that's okay. 3, so clean cut 2 edges. Put the 3-inch mark here, the 12-inch mark here, and this is really kind of, I would rather have longer than a 12-inch ruler, but I'm too lazy to go downstairs and get the longer one. So 3 inches by 12. And let's just back the ruler off to 7 inches first. Because this end will be our 2 2.5-inch squares, so I'll come back to that. And then we need to cut 4 1 3/4 inch pieces off of here. So I'm going to back up to 5 1/4. Right. Check my math. Yep, that's right. 5 1/4. 3 1/2, and 1 3/4. So that gives me my 4 pieces that are 1 3/4 wide. And then from this, we need 2 2.5-inch squares. So I'm going to go ahead and cut it down to 2 1/2 wide. So my 2 1/2 is on the long edge. It was already 5 inches long because we cut off a 5-inch section. I'm going to back my ruler up to the 2 1/2-inch mark and cut. My green strip I'm going to cut down to 3 inches wide by 8 inches long. So just like I always start, clean cut 2 edges. And then, because we're getting 2.5 inch squares, so add that together, that's 5 inches plus a 3 inch square, that's 8 inches. So I'm going to put my 8 inch mark down on the short edge, my 3 inch mark on the long edge, and cut. I'm going to back up to the 5 inch mark because that will give me my 3 inch square down on the other end. Then I'm going to cut this strip down to 2.5 inches wide and back my ruler up to the 2.5 inch mark because this would already be 5 inches since we cut off 3 inches on the other end. And that completes the cutting for this block. We're going to make half square triangles using the 2 gold 2.5 inch squares and the 2 green ones. So I'm using my magic wand, but you could just do the one line and stitch 1/4 inch away from it on both sides. So I need to pair these up, right sides together, a gold and a green, 2 sets of those, and sew the 2 lines, whether it's 1/4 inch from the center line or on the 2 lines you marked. I've sewn my 2 lines on my squares. I'm going to cut them in half, just like we've done on all the others this month. We are going to open them up and press toward the green, which I've already done on a couple. And then we're going to trim our blocks down to 1 3/4 inches. We have a little more than we have had on some. So I'm using the block lock. If you don't have one, you could just line up the 45-degree line on your square ruler with your seam, trim 2 edges, and then turn it and trim down to the 1 3/4. So I'm sliding my block lock back to my 1 3/4 mark. Trim. I'll do one more. So remember, when we start, we want to make sure that the point is on the seam. That's the one place you could mess up with the block lock. I'm going to clean cut 2 edges, rotate, and off the screen. The 1 3/4 marks here. Cut and cut. So you'll trim all 4 of them down. We're ready to put our block together. So we're going to do it in rows. Again, this is just an irregular or uneven 9 patch. I do want to point out the pattern does not tell you which way to point your greens. I do have the color picture, so I have an advantage over you. The green is pointing in toward the center. If you didn't do that, you'd have kind of an odd looking block. It would still be a block, but I think it's better with the green pointing in toward the center. So in rows, and we're going to press in toward the center, out, away, and in toward the center. All that's left is to sew our rows together, and we're going to want to match the seams here and here and here and here and here and here. Here's my finished Puss in the Corner block. I did pop the last seams and press going different directions.